Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I'm very happy to bring the conversation I had with Nick Lloyd. Nick is Professor of Modern Warfare at King's College in London. And he has a PhD from the University of Birmingham. And he is the author of 5 books, including the most recent, which is a second part of 3 in the trilogy. The most recent is The Eastern Front, A History of the Great War, 1914 and 1918. That would be World War I. Previously, he had put out The Western Front, which is also very good. And he is currently writing the third part of the series, the trilogy on World War I, which takes place in other parts of the world. Eastern Front is often neglected, and we talk about that. So we start by talking about the Eastern Front, what that is, why it's neglected in popular understanding. We talk about the major players and the landscape of the Eastern Front and the role of Galicia. We discuss 1915, the fall of Serbia, the impact of the Russian Revolution. We kind of go through all of the years of the war briefly, 1916, 1917, and then we get to the final years of the war and many other topics. This is really fun to talk about because a lot of the times we hear about World War II. There's much that has been said about World War II. There's been some things that have been talked about with World War I in kind of public understanding, but and I think probably the more recent film, 1917, was kind of got into people's minds again. But World War I is interesting. It's interesting the players, but even more so, it's interesting where Eastern Europe, kind of the Balkan states, fits in here as well. So this was a lot of learning for me, and I loved reading the book and loved talking with Nick. He's a wealth of knowledge on this stuff, so he's absolutely fantastic. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. I'm also on YouTube, so get over there, like, subscribe, follow, share with your friends. And now I bring you Nick Lloyd. I am here with Nick Lloyd. Nick, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm very excited to talk to you. You have written a wonderful book. This is the part 2 of 3 in the trilogy of sorts. So the book is called The Eastern Front, A History of the Great War, 1914 and 1918. Of course, that's World War I. You have the previous book, the Western Front, and then the pending third one to round us up. So anyways, we're going to talk about the Eastern Front. Could you just tell listeners briefly, just who you are academically, professionally, and just a guess about this sort of trilogy that you've come to write?
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Well, I work with King's College London in the UK and have been a historian all my career, mainly writing about the First World War. And I've written, a number of books on different sort of aspects of the war, particularly the military history of the war. And I'd written a book on the Battle of Passchendaele, or the Third Battle of Ypres, in 2017. And I wasn't necessarily sure what to do next. And then I thought, actually, I could do a bigger book on the history of the Western Front. So the whole war, really. I'd done battles. I'd covered individual episodes from that conflict. But I thought, actually, I could do the whole thing, because I really wanted to bring in the German and the French role, because I think certainly from a British perspective, we know about sort of our army, but the whole war tends to be not necessarily as known about. And so particularly the role of the French, but also what the Germans are up to, and bringing the Americans in as well. So doing it as a whole single narrative, which is, I think, more difficult than people think it might be. And so that way I started that process and started talking to my publishers about doing a book on the Western Front. And they were very happy, and I think it was a really interesting step for me. And it was only when I started writing the Western Front that I thought, actually, there is so much else I can do here, and so I felt I had to do the whole war. And I think, well, obviously there was so much about the Eastern Front that I could only really talk about in passing in the Western Front. I could sort of refer to it in places, what was going on in Galicia and Poland and the Balkans, but I couldn't talk about it in that much detail. And so I thought I have to do the Eastern Front. And I think then the natural sort of final book would be a book on the Middle Eastern War, the war against the Ottoman Empire, the colonial war. And so it felt very natural into a trilogy. It didn't start off that way, but it felt that would be a natural 3-book trilogy that would provide a complete narrative history of the First World War.
Yeah, well, I think it's really spectacular because a lot of people, again, don't. I mean, people that are within this world obviously will know, but just the general public, if you will, we don't hear as much about World War One. We know plenty about World War Two, but even more specifically, I mean, for me, it was a lot of it was new. Was when people talk about World War One, they talk about usually the Western Front, right? And we talk about trench warfare and things like that, but the Eastern Front is so neglected. And so a lot of this was so much learning for me, which was just wonderful. So maybe we'll talk about the Western Front at some other point. So maybe just give us an overview of this much neglected Eastern Front. What makes it unique and different from the Western Front during World War One? And why I guess it gets neglected so much.
Yeah, I mean, from a British perspective, I think from a French perspective, and maybe from an American perspective, when we think about the First World War, we think about the Western Front. We have images of trenches. Poetry from the war is very, very popular still, and obviously that's predominantly from the Western Front. And so that has really bitten deep into our popular perception of what the war is. But of course, that was only one aspect and one part of the war. And so the Eastern Front, as you've said, I think has been much more neglected in terms of popular understanding. And I think it's neglected for a number of reasons. I think it's overshadowed by things like the Russian Revolution, which has attracted a lot of attention. And it's obviously, when we talk about the Eastern Front, generally, most of the time, we're talking about the Eastern Front in the Second World War as well. And so it's been kind of neglected in that sense as well, just as well as the difficulty of finding the material and the different languages, the different, a large number of different countries and ethnic groups and were involved in this war. And I think that's meant it's been quite difficult for historians to grasp it. And so, I mean, this is really where the war begins. It begins in the Balkans and it spreads quickly to what will become the Eastern Front, before, of course, spreading to the Western Front and then out from there to the more global war. But I think the Eastern Front really is at the heart of what the war is about. And it's that conflict between the Russian Empire, Austria, Hungary, and Serbia, of course. Germans are involved as well. But I write about what I call the Greater Eastern Front, which is the fronts really that sort of surround that. So it's not just the main battles against the Russian army, but it's also the conflict in the Balkans, which draws in states, of course, like Serbia, but also Romania and Bulgaria. And the Italian front, the Italians against the Austrians, is one of those, I think, neglected fronts, which has a real importance and becomes more important as the war goes on. And so this book doesn't just tell the story of the Eastern Front, but also what I call the Greater Eastern Front, to provide that. Because I think if you're just focusing on the Austrians against the Russians, you're really neglecting what's happening in the Balkans and on the Italian front. But they all had an impact. They all forced the Austrians to, think very carefully about where they would send their troops. And so actually, when you look at it in the round, I think it gives you a much more comprehensive, a better understanding of the First World War and how it developed and when it ended when it did.
Yeah, I think that's right, and you certainly do that. So maybe tell us, you've kind of given us a little bit of the broader picture there of the Eastern Front. Maybe tell us, there's this one big piece there in the beginning. So Hungary declares war on Serbia in July 1914, and you have this then kind of the landscape of Poland and Galicia that are kind of the big places. So maybe just tell us what's going on here. The Austrian, Hungarian, empire declaring war on Serbia in 1914. and you can kind of bring Russia into here as well. Who are these big players, and why are they wanting to declare war over here? What's the landscape look like in this region of the world?
Well, this is a big question, and I think it's one that's fascinated historians for generations, really. Obviously, you have Austria-Hungary, which is a predominant power in the Balkans and in sort of Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe. You obviously have the German Empire as well. And of course, the Russian Empire, which of course covers the Baltic states and Poland, as we would know now. So those three empires are, up against each other. And obviously, you have Serbia, which is one of these rising states in the Balkans, which is sort of rubbing up against Austria and causing a lot of friction. And of course, you have the assassination of the Archduke and Austria wanting to strike back against Serbia. And of course, Serbia is not necessarily allied to Russia, but they have quite a lot of ties, and Russia sees Serbia as a client state. And of course, you'd had the Balkan Wars, you'd had a lot of upheaval in the region in the years before the First World War. And there was a feeling, certainly in Russia, that they weren't going to let Austria have a completely clear run in the Balkans, and actually Austria's annexed Bosnia-Herzegovina as well before the war, and there was a feeling that Austria was, acting very dangerously towards Serbia, and the Russians didn't want this. From Austria's perspective, they feel that actually Serbia is kind of like a gangster state. It's out of control, and it needs to be put down and controlled in a way that would stop these kind of acts of terrorism. And so you can sort of see it from both sides, really. And obviously you have the July crisis when Austria is trying to make a stand against Serbia and trying to actually pressure Serbia. But for various reasons, most of the powers in the region aren't going to back down this time. They'd had various crises in the sort of previous decade where they had backed down, or there'd been some kind of agreement. Things had de-escalated, but for various reasons, most of the powers involved don't really feel they want to compromise at this point. And so Austria feels it has to take action against Serbia, and of course Russia feels that it has to take action to protect Serbia. And again, the key player here, of course, is Germany, the major military power in Europe, and it feels, well, of course, it wants to support its ally, Austria. It fears Russia, and it fears that actually war now might not be a bad option because Russia are only going to get more powerful. That was the thinking at the time. Russia are going to get more powerful. They're going to get quicker to mobilize. So actually war now might not be too bad. We can strike when maybe Russian power isn't at its zenith, where Russian mobilization plans aren't actually completely finalized. And so we can now or never, I think is the phrase that Field Marshal Moltke, the German Chief of the General Staff, says. And so for various reasons, the powers that be decide they want to sort of take a firm stand here. And of course, it's the German operations plan, the Schlieffen plan, that means they have to go to the west. And so you have a kind of curious strategic asymmetry going on here, whereas Russia, that kind of triangle between those two states is not really, it's kind of out of sync, if you will. So, for example, the Austrians want to strike Serbia. They don't want to fight Russia for obvious reasons. Russia's a very big army. Germany don't want to fight the Russians. They want to fight the French, or they want to fight the French first. And so they don't want to have that. And so the Germans are saying to the Austrians, look, don't worry about Serbia. Put all your forces to hold off the Russians while we send up most of our, 80% of our army to fight the French. Of course, the Austrians don't want to do this. They don't want to tangle with the Russians, and they don't want to, they want to crush Serbia quickly. That would be the best case scenario. And communication and coordination between the Austrian and German plans is almost non-existent. So it's very, very poorly managed. The Russians are similarly, they're kind of split between should they concentrate against Germany or concentrate against Austria. Now, clearly they want to concentrate against Austria. That's where the battle is. That's where they have territorial gains. They would like to push their border further into the Carpathians. And they know that the Austrians are going to be, they feel they can take the Austrians. They're going to be weak. They don't particularly want to fight the Germans. They have a healthy respect for the prowess of the Kaiser's armies. Of course, the French are telling the Russians that you must concentrate against Germany, not Austria, because you'll never have a better chance to strike the Germans down and advance deep, maybe even take Berlin. But the Russians don't really want to do that. Now, they do send 2 armies into East Prussia, but their heart is never really in it. And so the outbreak of the war and the first steps of the war are tragic. It's almost like a comedy of errors in many ways.
I guess that you mentioned this here, you mentioned it in the beginning, this critical role of Galicia and Poland, and how Russia did want to try and ward off a unified Poland. You can bring in here the Habsburgs if you want as well, but in terms of land, in terms of land and countries, what was it about these places? I mean, it sounds like the Balkan states are just kind of getting sandwiched in between, big Russia, big Germany, and then, off a little bit more west to, with the French. So all these Balkan states are just kind of right there. And so obviously Poland's right there, Galicia is there. Tell us about the critical elements of these parts where the war is fought in the Eastern Front.
Yeah, I mean, obviously the Russian Empire wants really to move their border much closer to the Carpathians, which they regard as a kind of natural border. And of course, they're not necessarily, it's not that they want East Prussia, but obviously, an expansion of the empire is good for many reasons. And certainly the Tsar is concerned that he is going to look weak. Or remember, Russia's had a revolution in 1905. There's growth of democracy in Russia. And so I think for the Tsar, there's a feeling of it's sort of an expansionist empire growing, actually taking terrain is going to be really important for his legitimacy and for the sense of the Russian people actually gaining something. So they really want to push that border much, into the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And they feel that would be a way of sort of deflecting some of the kind of growing nationalism within the sort of western half of the empire that they're having to deal with. And so that becomes quite an important element. And of course, the Balkan states are already sandwiched. They've fought off the Ottomans, of course, in the First and Second Balkan Wars. But, there's that sort of surging, unsatisfied nationalism which is growing up, which all the main powers are concerned about. For Austria, they're concerned that the rise of nationalism, whether it's sort of Romania or Serbia or Ukrainian or Poland or Italian nationalism, is going to break their multinational empire apart. And so they're concerned about that. And therefore, a demonstration of power, demonstration of will is going to, put the genie back into the bottle, as it were. And so for various reasons, those two powers, in many ways similar reasons, are looking at the landscape and believing that a demonstration of military power will kind of nullify many of these political concerns and growths of political unrest that they've seen.
Tell about the Habsburgs. So obviously, they're all in this region. This big kind of dynasty that has been there. I mean, it was. Oh my goodness, what was it? 800 years. Whenever they went, they had so many losses in the opening days of the war, and so in the first year going into 1914 and then going into 15, there were a lot of losses there. Tell us just what kind of happened in 1914 first year on this side, on the Eastern Front, going into 1915, and what was the big thing there?
Well, I mean, you have a series of enormous battles, really almost very difficult to describe how big they are, these huge infantry engagements, these rolling engagements across miles and miles and miles of open plain, which cause enormous casualties and don't necessarily provide a decision. And so you have a whole series of battles that take place. Now, the Austrians do try and invade Serbia, and they don't get very far. They're counterattacked, and they kind of get pushed out very quickly. So the Serbian campaign, which should have been their kind of main effort, is almost ended within a matter of weeks. It's a disastrous opening campaign. And then, of course, Konrad von Hotzendorf, the Austrian chief of staff, is desperately trying to send most of his army to the north to hold off the Russians that are advancing to the south and southwest. And as I say, you have a number of engagements where the Austrians do quite well. There's a Battle of Krasnik in late August where they almost encircle the Russian army, but they can't quite manage it, and they have to retreat because the Russians are there's quite a lot of limitations with Russian power, but the Russians are there in numbers and they have a kind of earthy toughness which forces the Austrians back. The Austrians are quite fragile, they lack firepower, lack artillery. And so they really can't seal the deal. They can't really, conduct decisive operations in the way that Conrad would like. And so while the Austrians are tangling with, it's sort of like, the Austrians are a middleweight, they're against a heavyweight in a way. They can throw a few punches, they can move about a bit, but ultimately, as soon as those blows begin to land, the weight difference, the class difference is going to make a huge difference. That's going to tell. And so it starts off very, very poorly for Austria, whereas they're unsuccessful in Serbia, and they're tangling with the Russians, and their divisions are getting chewed up very, very quickly. At the same time, in East Prussia, 2 Russian armies have invaded. But the Germans, there's a single German army in East Prussia, the 8th, is able to hold one army off, redeploy rapidly, surround the Russian Second Army at the Battle of Tannenberg in late August of 1914. And Tannenberg is probably the single most famous battle of the Eastern Front, where they can do what they'd always wanted, this sort of double envelopment, where the Germans are able to envelop an almost entire Russian army and destroy it. And Tannenberg has really serious implications for the war. Gives the German army a kind of aura of invincibility. And, of course, is a huge setback for the Tsar's forces. And from that point onwards, they're very, very wary about tangling with German divisions. And again, it underscores that in this war, they're going to be able to chew up the Austrians, but the Germans are a very, very different kettle of fish. And so they have these 2 poles of the Eastern Front where Germany is very successful, Austria is not. And of course, the Germans are saying to the Austrians, well, look, we've done more than enough here. We've held off 2 entire Russian armies here. But from the Austrian perspective, they're continually, and it only gets louder as the war goes on, they're continually requesting reinforcements and support, because if they don't get it, they may well collapse. And so that sort of, that relationship between the Germans and the Austrians is an uneasy one, and it never really gets better, because the Austrians are continually asking for more support. And although the Germans feel they've done enough, they have a decision to make. Well, are we going to let the Austrians collapse? And ultimately, that's not in their interests, and so they have to gradually send divisions across. So by the following year, about a third of the German army is going to be on the Eastern Front. And that will remain pretty much constant for the rest of the war.
Yeah, wow. So when we get to 1915, you talk about this Germany, Austria, Hungary signing a military convention with Bulgaria. So right at the frontier of the Ottoman Empire. And you also talk about, I thought this part of the book was really fascinating, the conquest of Serbia. I mean, it gets absolutely destroyed. I mean, it's very costly. When we're looking at 1915, tell us about how Bulgaria gets involved here, with Germany, Austria, and this conquest of Serbia, which was pretty devastating. And tell us about this bit here.
So the Germans begin to make that decision that, Falkenhayn, who's the chief of the general staff, he doesn't believe that war can be won in the East. He still believes that it can only be won in the West. So he's not particularly minded to send lots of troops to the East, but having said that, if he doesn't, the Austrians may collapse. So that's the sort of decision he has. And so he sends reinforcements to the East in the spring of 1915, and they attack a place called Gorlice Tarnov, which is a key part of the front, and they're very successful, and this is one of the key attacks of the war. So they're able to push the Russians back, essentially out of Poland. It becomes the Great Retreat. It's wildly successful. They never thought they would be able to do it. But there's huge problems in the Russian army, real lack of ammunition, lack of guns, lack of railways behind the front, so they can't redeploy quickly, real morale crisis. And so the Russians really, although they're able to make successful operations against the Austrians, there are serious limitations with what the Russians can do. There's poor morale. often poor officer corps, officer command, a lack of artillery, a lack of shells, confusion about strategy. There's a whole range of problems they have. And so the Germans basically take control of the war in the east from the spring. And once they have done that, they begin to start to think about where else their military power can be employed. And of course, Serbia is the obvious place. Now, obviously, the Balkans have been fighting each other in the wars before the First World War, so there's no love lost on either side. And there's those two powers. There's Romania and Bulgaria that are, at one time they've been allied to Serbia, at another time they've been enemies of Serbia, and so they're really looking at the situation and waiting to take advantage of what happens. And of course, the Bulgarians would love to get one over on the Serbians again, and so they come in on the Central Powers. They believe that actually now is the time that they can take advantage of this. The Romanians stay out until the following year. They come in on the side of the Allies, but both states are really looking at essentially what's going on and when they can ask the highest price for coming into the war. The Italians do it as well. In the same time, in May of 1915, they come in on the side of the Entente against Austria. So once Germany has pushed this great retreat, they send an expeditionary force down to take charge of the conquest of Serbia. Part of the reason is because if they can get rid of Serbia, they can then have a complete resupply of the Ottoman Empire. They can actually reach Turkey, which of course is an ally. And so that will kind of consolidate their military potential and that central position that they have. Serbia blocks the way. And so Austria, Bulgaria, and Germany then mount a campaign against Serbia in the sort of September and October of 1915. And Serbia is overrun relatively quickly, and their troops essentially withdraw through Albania, where they're picked up by British Royal Navy and French Navy ships and taken to the island of Corfu. So Serbia is overrun by the end of 1915, and by the end of 1915, the Central Powers are completely dominant on the Eastern Front. Russia has been pushed back, well, not defeated, but it has lost huge territory in the west, in its western half. Serbia has been overrun. Bulgaria has joined, and so at the end of 1915, despite Austria's mishaps, things aren't really going too badly.
Yeah, it's interesting how the first part of the war is kind of in favor a little bit of the Central Powers, even in the Eastern Front. And so things start to sort of take a turn, definitely in 1917. But in 1916, you talk about a few things in 1916. You talk about Cardana's victories in middle of 1916, and definitely in August of 1916, how it became a pretty tough month for the Central Powers. You also have the Romanian campaign as well at the end of 1916. So maybe I guess, to get us to like the middle of 1916 here, where the Central Powers start taking a hit, what changed or what evolved from end of 1915, they're feeling pretty good, they're, in terms of victories, and then you get to middle of 1916, and all of a sudden, the tide starts turning a little bit, and then you get the Romanian thing at the end of 1916. Tell us kind of that kind of narrative there.
Well, I think the Eastern Front is so fascinating because the war sort of always continually changes and grows, and so this is one of the reasons I think you have to look at it from that greater perspective, because the Balkans become so central to it, and so the Russians are able to sort of take stock of the war, 1915-16, and they mount what become the Brusilov offensive in the summer, which is a very big offensive, and it's probably Russia's best offensive of the war. They're able to utilize a lot of Western Front techniques, aerial reconnaissance, different kinds of artillery bombardments, different kinds of shells, specialist infantry tactics, and they concentrate on the southern part of the front, and it's actually devastating for the Austrians. They lose an almost entire army within a week. It's a devastating offensive. And so again, the Austrians are chronically weak now, and again are really being propped up by the Germans now without any. There's no doubt that really they can't really continue the war in an independent fashion. They are really being told what to do by the Germans. And because Brusilov's been quite successful, the Romanians come in, and the Romanians are really kind of naive in that sense. They think it's going to be easy, but they're overrun very quickly. So they enter the war and actually invade Austria, invade Hungary in August of 1916, but are overrun very, very quickly. So the Germans cobble together an expeditionary force. The Bulgarians attack from the south and are able to overrun Romania by December. Bucharest is taken before Christmas. And so again, it's sort of there are still some significant successes from the Central Powers perspective, but the opening of another front is still deeply concerning. And also, at this point, the Italian front is continuing, and what happens is the Italians keep attacking along the Isonzo. There's eventually, I think, 12 battles of the Isonzo, but the Italians. The fighting continues to increase in intensity, and the Italians get better and better and better, and they're able to throw more stuff at the Austrian lines. And so, even when they're able to overrun Romania, the Austrian forces are still very, very thinly, strung out across multiple different fronts. And the Italians are still learning and getting stronger, and so it's a sort of mixed picture. 1916, the Austrians are still in the war somehow. Romania's come in, but again, that extends the front out to the south. And the Russians have kind of had their big moment in the Brusilov offensive. But I think the key thing of 1916 is there are successes for the Allies, but fundamentally for Russia, once the Brusilov offensive sort of peters out, when Germans are able to redeploy troops, send support, once that peters out by late summer of 1916, the Russian army is almost finished in a way. It's increasingly struggling with poor morale, and there's a sense that if they're not going to win now, then is it ever really going to happen for them?
Mm-hmm. So we get to 1917, which is a huge year. It's a big year in a lot of ways, and I think this is what I was really interested to read in the book. Was, obviously we have the Russian Revolution in the middle of World War I that happens in 1917. I guess the big question here is, you could talk generally, I guess, but really as it pertains to the Eastern Front, because it's right there. How much did the Russian Revolution impact the war on the Eastern Front? Or you could say it another way, if this didn't happen at this time, this is these kind of what if scenarios, but, could things have been a little bit different? But I guess, was this part of the thing that kind of weakened Russia a bit? Or what was it, I guess, that the Russian Revolution really contributed to how things were going in the war on the Eastern Front?
Yeah, I mean, no, it's of huge significance. I think that's why it's attracted so much attention and interest, and it's one of those great moments in the 20th century. It does mark a sea change. But I mean, from my perspective, in terms of the war, there is a sense that some of the historians, the sort of Eastern Front ends in 1917, and that's really not the case. It continues into 1918. The war doesn't end. What you have is essentially a palace coup. There's been concerns about leadership in Russia for a while now, obviously going back almost over a decade in a way, but the Tsar is he's obviously a figurehead for the empire, but the struggles they've had, he's become commander-in-chief, he's taken control of Russia's armies in the field in 1915. And he was warned at the time that obviously if you do this, then you'll be held directly responsible for any reverses. And so he ties his own person very much closely with the war effort. So he can't sack any more generals, he can't sack himself. So that's a problem. There's concern about, most famously Rasputin becomes this kind of lightning rod for concern about the empire and the sort of diseased state of the empire. And of course, this sort of obscenity of Rasputin, this sort of strange holy man who seems to have access to the Tsar's family. And again, there's lots of rumors spread about Rasputin's sort of evil intentions. And so Rasputin becomes a problem in terms of the legitimacy of the regime. And essentially what happens is you have this outbreak of essentially food riots in Petrograd, St. Petersburg, as we would call it. And it sort of gets out of control. And the Tsar is really not minded to do much about this, or at least send troops to put it down. But the politicians in Petrograd are saying, actually, well, look, we need some kind of political reform, which you've been asking for many years now, that will actually give a sort of government of national confidence or something, essentially a government that is actually more of a democratic government, or a government that is responsible to the people. And the Tsar doesn't believe this, doesn't want this. He is been put there by God to rule Russia, therefore he doesn't see this. But a number of the Tsar's senior generals have had misgivings about the Tsar for many years, and their view is actually, look, if you abdicate, then this will allow order to be restored quickly, this will restore confidence, and this will allow us to prosecute the war in a more efficient, better way. And the Tsar essentially accepts this, steps down. He initially puts his brother in, but then he refuses the throne. You can't necessarily, if you abdicate, it should fall naturally to the next in command, which should have been Nicholas's son. But he's obviously has haemophilia, and there's concerns about his health, and so essentially the Tsar steps down, and they form a provisional government in the spring of 1917. But of course, this doesn't really stop the problems and restore confidence. It actually just really undermines the whole legitimacy of the entire state. And what you see through 1917 is the gradual and then progressive and then sudden destruction, demoralization, and disintegration of the Russian army. And so this is, in one hand, this is beyond the wildest dreams of the German high command. This is absolutely wonderful. Initially, they're not sure what result this is going to have. They fear that it will result in a kind of revitalized war effort, but of course it doesn't, and the morale of the troops is essentially broken at this point. And so, when you look through the 1917, as I go in the book, at the army and how it gradually just falls to pieces, it's an absolutely horrifying story.
Yeah, it really is. There's just like this disintegration of sorts, and it's quite it's reading. It's just like, what? Oh my goodness, and so you had mentioned just a bit ago that some people think 1917 is where the Eastern Front kind of ends, I guess. But how do you feel it doesn't? How does it continue to go into 1918? And then I guess one other question here, because I was curious about it, is, kind of, I guess, infamously, if you will, the U.S. gets involved in World War I extremely late. Wilson doing his neutral thing, and he gets involved, and I think there's involvement in the Western Front. But was there any U.S. involvement in the Eastern Front, or they just didn't even get that far at that point? And so, yeah, tell us, how is the Eastern Front still kind of there into the last, year of the war, 1918, and then was there any U.S. involvement on the Eastern Front?
Yeah, I mean, there isn't any sort of American involvement as such. I mean, there are plenty of discussions with the Entente, the British and French, about essentially trying to restart the Eastern Front in sort of 18, particularly in 1918. But none of it really comes to much. So what you see, I mean, I think the Eastern Front doesn't end in 1917. I mean, you have a number of Russian offensives, the so-called Kerensky offensive in the summer of 1917. And so there continuous fighting during the summer. But as that dies away, and as it starts quite well, and then it rapidly kind of weakens. The charge that they have weakens. And then you have the changing of the war, and so it begins to. By the end of the year, you have the beginnings of the Russian Civil War, where they try and kind of keep things going as best they can, but it increasingly it's really problematic. It's really difficult to do that, and then of course you have the gradual sapping of legitimacy from the government, the provisional government during 1917, and then the Bolsheviks take over in November. When they seize the Winter Palace in Petrograd, and then send a telegram to the Stavka, the Russian High Command, to immediately start peace negotiations with the Germans. And when the the Russian commander, a chap called Nikolai Dukhonin, says, "Well, no, who are you? You have no legitimacy, Lenin." They start sending troops and groups of red soldiers, Bolshevik agitators, to Stavka to get him and kill him, which they do. And so at this point, a lot of the Tsarist officers have either given up and gone home, or they are moving to the south, into Ukraine, the Caucasus, Rostov, down to the Volga, which is obviously still free territory. It's not controlled by the Bolsheviks. And they're then sort of trying to work out what to do next. But it's very clear that the kind of war is changing. And so the Eastern Front changes, and it becomes that civil war becomes a key thing. And of course, it's not really until March of 1918 that you have peace. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk is signed with the Central Powers and the Bolsheviks.
So I guess, how does the war end? You were mentioning it there. It's evolving, it's changing. You get the treaty in 1918. So on the Eastern Front, at least, we've mentioned the Habsburgs at many points here, but they end in November of 1918. They split into other nation states that we know probably today. But how does the war end, and how does the war ending in the Eastern Front look a little bit different or similar to how it was on the Western Front? I mean, if there is a distinction there to be made.
Yeah, so you have this treaty, Brest-Litovsk, which is become quite infamous, really, because the price that the Germans ask is quite high from Russia, and of course they lose huge swathes of the Western Empire, much of its industry, coal mining, huge wheat growing areas. Ukraine declares its independence as well, which is supported by the Central Powers, and so it's a huge humiliation. It's a huge price to pay for peace. And this, of course, debated at the time with the Bolsheviks, with many Bolsheviks saying this, we simply cannot have this. This is too much. Lenin gets his way. He says, look, I know this is a terrible thing to sign, but it's only temporary. We will get it back. We're going to spread revolution into the Central Powers. We can move on this, and moreover, if we sign the peace treaty, that will give the room for the revolution to survive and to take on its internal enemies, to strike back against the so-called whites, to really consolidate the regime. And they agree to that. But it doesn't mean the fighting's over. I mean, it just changes. So while Lenin is trying to then reconquer parts of Russia and spread Bolshevik agitation, he's also, continuing to flood German and Austrian lines with propaganda, with Marxist newspapers. And this was very frustrating for the Germans, because they are having to keep about 1 million troops in the East to hold it down, to hold on to their new conquests, and to bankroll Ukraine. And so they have won in the East. They've clearly won in the East. They've reduced Russia to a sort of rump state. But they don't have the time or the energy or the manpower to really consolidate those gains, because any spare troops are obviously being sent to the West for the great battle against the British and the Americans and the French. And so there's that brief window of opportunity the Germans have when they have conquered an entirely new empire in the East. They have won in the Eastern Front. But of course, they just simply cannot sustain it. And in that sense, the Bolsheviks are right.
I guess the final question I have here, which is really interesting, is when you think about the Eastern Front, you think about its importance, and again, as we said at the top, it has been neglected of sorts. What is the kind of the 2-minute version, I guess, if you will, of if you wanted to tell somebody, hey, here's why the Eastern Front of World War I is so important. Or why it's consequential for certain big things for the war. What would you say, kind of that snapshot view of why the Eastern Front is important for World War I?
I think it's, and I think I only really realized this once I'd written the book, is really how important it is for the subsequent history of Europe. And, all these empires collapsing, Russia collapsing, Austria collapsing in 1918, Germany collapsing in 1918. This great black hole of the vortex opens up in Central and Eastern Europe. which is the cause of so much heartbreak and terror for the rest of the 20th century. It doesn't really solve anything. It just opens up huge wounds that take generations to work themselves out. And so it's really almost the collapse of civilization itself in this period during the war. It's almost the worst tragedy to ever happen in European history up to this point, at least since the 30 Years' War. I mean, it's devastating in what it does, and it rips open, it takes civilization away, and it sort of, these new states rise up, and this whole ethnic question in Eastern Europe becomes really central. The position of the Jews, which of course will be played out in the Second World War. And so, and it of course spawns the Russian Revolution and the ideology of sort of Soviet communism, which you can say defines the 20th century. And so the Eastern Front of the First World War is so important, not just to the war, but the decline and fall of Europe, but also the new states that will rise in the East that will define the 20th century. And so it's of enormous consequence, I think, to not just the war itself, but the entire history of the 20th century.
Yeah, that's very nicely said. Well, Nick, I know you're a very busy guy, and I appreciate you coming on and talking to us about such an important part of history. And all the best on the third one that you're finishing up over there on for the trilogy. I look forward to reading that. And big thanks for coming on and talking about the Eastern Front.
My pleasure. Always great to talk about these things. And it will be great to chat about some of the other parts of the First World War in future.
Absolutely.